On July 24, 2006, AMD announced it would acquire ATi for a sum of $5.4 billion. Later that year, ATi became part of AMD's graphics product group. ATI CEO Dave Orton became the executive vice president of the visual and media business at AMD until he later resigned in 2007. In the days leading up to the ATI and AMD merger, Dave Orton signed a master copy of a certificate of authenticity. This certificate was later used to commemorate a pair of special edition Radeon cards that were the last of their kind. These were known as the Radeon X1950 XTX Uber editions. These special edition Radeons were sold in pairs and only 500 bundles were ever released. These bundles shipped in an all-black briefcase, and what lurked inside was a pair of Uber cards, a mouse pad, some stickers, a VIP customer care card, a bunch of cables, and a numbered certificate with Dave Orton's signature printed on it. Unfortunately, the two cards that I acquired came with none of this, just the cables, so sad face. The official release of this bundle was November 23, 2006, which was only 15 days after the launch of NVIDIA's DirectX 10 capable 8800 GTX. NVIDIA's brand new flagship launched at a cost of $599 USD, so you're probably wondering what was the price of this Uber bundle. Well, it was $788 USD, and that's a tough pill to swallow considering how capable the 8800 GTX was at the time. To be fair, this kit wasn't intended to win any price to performance awards, but geared more towards ATI faithfuls that couldn't wait for R600 to launch, or would-be video card collectors. With all its attention to detail, you'd expect these Uber cards to perform amazingly compared to their less Uber counterparts, right? Well, not really. Clock speeds of the GPU only increased by 20 MHz, and memory increased only slightly to the tune of 50 MHz. Now, these increases were certainly nothing earth-shattering. As far as availability was concerned, it was rumored that Japan got an allocation of 20 of the Uber Edition bundles, and the rest were split between North America and Europe. Now that we got a little bit of the history surrounding the cards and some of the differences compared to the base model, let's talk about what we're going to be testing in today's video. Obviously, we're going to test these special edition cards in a single card and Crossfire configuration, and admittedly, I did have a fair amount of issues getting Crossfire to work using Windows 7. After a while of cursing and smashing a few keyboards, I scrapped the Windows 7 idea and proceeded to load Windows XP 32-bit. As for the test system, well, it's completely overkill. For the testing today, I used a 3570 overclocked to 4.5 GHz, 16 GB of DDR3 clocked to 2400 MHz, and the rest is shown here. Obviously, the vast majority of the RAM will not be used in the 32-bit version of Windows XP, but the good news is it was never a limitation with the games that I tested. With the test system ready to go, I needed to find some additional contenders to line these bad boys up against, so let's quickly take a look at them. The FSP CMT 520 Plus is a full-featured mid-tower case that comes with 4 ARGB fans, front and side tempered glass panels, and has support for extended ATX motherboards. And for those of you who want to add RGB to an older PC, FSP includes a built-in RGB controller so you can change the lighting mode at the case I/O. No need for an RGB compatible motherboard or software. See the video's description to learn more. The first card up is the Radeon X1950 XT 512MB version. This was ATI's first foray into the world of Shader Model 3.0, and back in the day this card performed very well and offered a bit more flexibility compared to NVIDIA's offerings at the time. As for the second card, well, let's just grab another one for some Crossfire fun. Should be pretty interesting to see how well they stack up in these upcoming tests. Next up is the X1950 XTX, a card that changed the game when it came to raw pixel shading horsepower. This card was a force to be reckoned with during the time, and in fact it very rarely had to hold its own beer. I also wanted to throw in the OG version of the X1950 XTX to see how it compares to the Uber edition. This was the first video card to sport GDDR4 memory, and these cards were well known to be the fastest single DirectX 9 GPUs ever made. And the last ATI card is the ambitious HD2900 XT. Now, this card was ATI or AMD's first DirectX 10 capable GPU. It didn't win over a lot of gamers back in the day, but it still offered a marked performance improvement over its predecessor. Now, we can't let the red team have all the fun, so let's add a bit of green to the mix. Now, the first NVIDIA card is the 7800 GTX. This model is the more common 256MB variant. This former flagship offered a decent performance uplift over the 6800 Ultra that came before it. The next card to follow up the 7800 GTX is the 7900 GTX. Now, this card featured a die shrink from 110 nanometers to 90. It also sported more memory at 512 megabytes and higher clock speeds over its predecessor. And the last to hail from the 7900 series is the dual GPU beast, the 7950 GX2. Now, this card rocked two G71 GPUs, and its clock speeds fell in between the 7900 GTX and the 7900 GT. Now, even with the clock speed deficit at the time, it was known to be the fastest dual GPU DirectX 9 card ever made. Now, let's take a break from the NVIDIA 7000 series and enter the world of the 8800 GTX. Now, there's a lot to say about this legend, but in short, it introduced the first unified architecture and brought monster performance to the table back in 2006. Since I'm testing with the 3570K, I also wanted to see how Intel's HD4000i GPU performs against these former flagships. Now, while the HD4000 is better suited for DirectX 11 titles at low resolution and settings, let's see how it stacks up in some older DirectX 9 games. Now, that's it for the contenders, and here's a list of all of them, along with their specs and the tested frequencies. In today's video, we'll be benchmarking all of these GPUs in 7 games, ranging from 2005 to 2009. Now, all the games selected have Crossfire compatibility, as I wanted to see how the pair of Uber cards stacked up. On top of the game testing, I also added 3D Mark 2006, and will measure total system power consumption. Each benchmark run was completed 3 times and then averaged. With all that said, let's jump right into it. And the first game we're testing is the system killer from 2005, Fear. Now, using the built-in benchmark, I maxed out all of the settings along with a 4x FSAA at 1080p. Here we can see the Uber editions in Crossfire are leading the pack with a whopping 101 FPS on average. Now, that's 26% faster than the 8800 GTX and 74% faster than a single Uber card. Now, looking at the remaining cards, you can see the 7950 GX2 is holding its own and beating the 2900 XT, which sees its performance tank after enabling FSAA. Frame times do suffer a bit on the dual GPU cards as expected, and also Intel's HD4000 is doing pretty terrible here. I think the lack of optimization for this title is pretty evident. Let's move on to the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. I tested this game at 1600 by 900 using the high preset and HDR. No AA was used, as the 7 series NVIDIA cards cannot do AA and HDR at the same time. I tested a quick run through a town and field area of the game as shown here. Looking at the results, we can see the 8800 GTX claims the throne, producing 103 FPS on average. This beats out the Uber editions in Crossfire by about 35%. The Uber editions saw a 40% increase over the single card in this title. Additionally, the 2900 XT held its own against the 8800, but its frame time performance wasn't great by comparison. The 7900 GTX was 48% faster than the 7800 GTX, and it narrowly beat out the X1950 XTX. The Intel HD4000 did not perform well here, and I had to use Bloom instead of HDR as it was causing some issues. Now on to Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, and here I chose to benchmark the game at 1080p using the normal settings with high textures and no AA. And oh yeah, I added some of that sweet AF. Now I benchmarked the opening scene as it's consistent and demanding. Again, we're seeing the 8800 GTX as the chart topper, but the Uber duo is hot on its heels. Now fortunately, the Uber card's frame times are much worse compared to NVIDIA's flagship, but that's pretty much expected from dual GPU solutions. Now we see a 62% gain going from a single Uber to 2 in Crossfire, and we also can see the X1900 cards do very well in this game with their brute force shader capability, while the 7000 series NVIDIA cards fall flat on their faces. Let's now take a look at a game from 2007 that convinced PC gamers they desperately needed an upgrade. Now, I didn't go crazy with the settings on this one, as I only chose 720p with the medium preset and then used the built-in benchmark. Now, the Uber cards in Crossfire did well, but they were still nearly 40% behind the 8800 GTX. Now, running the Ubers in Crossfire displayed a 40% performance jump over the single card, and the Intel HD 4000 held its own against the NVIDIA 7000 series of cards. Now, speaking of the 7000 series, as you can see, well, they performed quite terribly in this game. Now, most of this poor performance can be attributed to the shader quality being set to medium, but I'll go more into detail on this a bit later in the video. Devil May Cry 4 is the next game I selected, and here I cranked the settings up to high at 1080p and used no AA. I also used a standalone benchmark utility to get my numbers. Now, the two Uber cards kicked some butt in this title, as they were only 6% slower than the 8800 GTX. Now, frame times are obviously not great by comparison, but it's still an impressive result. Comparing both Uber cards to a single one, we're seeing almost 100% scaling, which is extremely impressive. Looking at the 7950 GX2, we can see it gained some ground and beat the X1900 series cards by about 15% or so. Now, the X1800 XT and the 7800 GTX are nearly tied for the bottom position. And the second to last game we're testing is Far Cry 2, and I selected the high preset with HDR enabled at 720p. I used the Ranch Small built-in benchmark scene to get my numbers. Now, looking at the top of the charts, we can see the Ubers and Crossfire are neck and neck with the 8800 GTX, and the 2900 XT isn't too far behind. Again, we're seeing some impressive scaling results from the Crossfire configuration, right around 84%. Now, the X1800 XT in Crossfires also came out swinging this title, but frame times suffer as expected. This also appears to be another game where the 7000 series of cards just crumble. I also noticed the 7800 GTX 256MB of VRAM became a limitation, as it was completely saturated during this benchmark. And the last game we tested today is Stalker Call of Pripyat, so Chikabrike. I used the high preset and cranked the lighting, and benched the game at 720p using the standalone benchmarking utility. Now, the Ubers put up a good fight, but they couldn't quite touch the 8800 GTX in this one. With that being said, these cards still saw a 75% performance increase over the single card. The 7950 GX2 built up some courage and barely beat out the X1950 XTX. With these settings selected, it's no surprise to see the 7800 GTX sit at the bottom, as this game tends to like the VRAM. I also figured the HD 4000 would have done a bit better in this game, but that does not appear to be the case. Now, we're done testing the 7 games in this roundup, so let's add the numbers up and average them out. Now, starting at the bottom, the Intel HD 4000 graphics appear to be 32% faster than the 7800 GTX, and nearly on par with the X1800 XT and the 7900 GTX. The 7950 GX2 was dead even with the X1900 XTX, but slightly lost out to the faster X1950 XTX and Uber Edition. The X1800 XT cards in Crossfire are nicely nestled in between the single Uber card and the 2900 XT. We also see the Uber Edition is only 4% faster compared to the base X1950 XTX, so not huge gains as expected. Now, the Uber Duo does outperform the 2900 XT by about 12%, and the 8800 GTX ends up only being 11% faster than them. That's not too shabby at all, as these Uber Editions hold their own. Along with the gaming test, I also wanted to include the results from 3D Mark 2006. I used the default settings and included the total score, along with Shader Model 2.0 and 3.0 scores. The results are nearly in line with our game averages, so I'm not going to go over all the numbers here, but feel free to pause the video to get a better look at the results. The last result I want to go over is total system power consumption. Now, to get these numbers, I used a kilowatt meter along with 3D Mark 06, then I took an average after the first scene of the benchmark. Now, these numbers might not be scary as some of you were expecting, and the 3570K isn't much of a power hog, but even so, the CPU isn't being stressed too much during this testing. Now, obviously, the Intel 4000 series is going to be the lowest result, coming in at a measly 98 watts. Now, there isn't much difference comparing the 7800 GTX versus the 7900 GTX, as power savings gained by the process shrink was quickly eaten up by the much higher clock speeds and faster memory. It is impressive to see the system using the dual GPU 7950 GX2 only consuming 190 watts, which is a bit lower than the X1900 series of cards and the 8800 GTX. The X1950 XTX uses slightly more power compared to the X1950 XTX, as the latter uses lower power GDDR4. Now the single Uber edition does use slightly more power versus the base card because of its clock speed bump. Additionally, it's widely known as the 2900 XT does like the juice, but it's nothing compared to the Uber editions, sitting fat and happy at the top, consuming a cool 330 watts. As we start to wrap things up, I did want to go over a couple things that I found to be pretty interesting. First, it's crazy to see how the once mighty GeForce 7000 series has fallen. If you go back and read reviews from the time period, you'll see how well the 7000 series card performed compared to their ATi rivals. You can also look at the launch prices to get a good idea on how these series stacked up. I mentioned this a couple of times, but I believe the main reason the 7000 series of cards didn't age as well is because they are completely shader bound in a number of titles beyond 2006. Now going back to the Crysis benchmark, it shows really how bad the 7000 series of cards perform. The testing was done with the shader quality settings set to medium, so let's take a look and see what happens when I drop that setting to low. Yeah, that's quite the performance jump, as you can see. To be fair, Nvidia did put more stock into pixel shader processing with the 7800 GTX over the 6800 Ultra. The general microarchitecture and feature sets were very similar, but it is believed the G70 shaders run at twice the performance of the previous gen. Of course, that doesn't necessarily convert to double the performance in all games, but in some shader-limited games, it is a possibility. While it's nice to know that Nvidia had some foresight into future demands of shader processing, the 7000 series do not hold a candle to what ATI had in store with the X1900 series. While it's not dramatically different from the X1800 series, the X1900 took the 4 quad pixel shader cores and bam, they tripled it. While both the R520 found in the X1800 and the R580 found in the X1900 were considered to be fixed function designs, their pixel shader engines, including the ultra-threading dispatch processor, closely resembled a forward-thinking SIMT design. Because of this design, you do see a large performance gap compared to the 7000 series in games that have high pixel shading requirements. It's awesome to see how GPU architectures have aged throughout the years, with both companies experience their ups and downs. Besides this, the only other result that surprised me was the Intel HD 4000. I fully expected this iGPU to perform a bit better than it did. Now, it wasn't VRAM limited, as the driver and OS will dynamically allocate up to 1GB of system memory in Windows XP to help alleviate any VRAM deficits. Now, during all of my testing, clock speeds were extremely consistent and temps were fine. As I previously mentioned, I suspect the games tested today didn't have much in the way of driver optimizations. Now, as we come back to the X1950 XTX Uber editions, I personally really like these cards. Not because of their performance over the base X1950, but because they are the last special edition cards that ATI ever released. As shown in my testing, they performed extremely well in games that are designed to work with Crossfire, nearly keeping up with the once mighty 8800 GTX. So I think it's pretty safe to say that back in the day, price and performance of these cards were pretty uber. Well, that's it, people. I appreciate you sticking around, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to support my work on this channel, please consider using my affiliate links found in the video's description. And if you'd like to join us over on the Pixel Talk Discord server to talk new and retro tech, please click on the link below. And as always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video.